It's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly dive into the world of Korean literature and books through works in Korean and in English translations as well. This week we have with us cultural essayist Colin Marshall, who's also host of his own podcast, Kolin의 한국, and author of the essay collection 한국 요약 금지. He has joined us now in the studio. Colin, hello. It's great to see you.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so it looks like you've brought a book of poetry in the studio for us today, or is it a comic book? Can you tell us a bit more?
It's actually both, which is what caught my eye about it in the first place. This is 달리지마, the latest collection from the poet Oh Bong-ok. But it's hardly a normal book of verse, and in fact, it's the very first example, here or elsewhere, of what's been called webtoon shi, a hybrid form of poetry, shi of course, and webtoons, or the comics people read online. And here in Korea, as you know, they read them with a special fervor.
Sure, okay. So there's a lot going on there. First, the title, 달리지마. When you hear it, it means don't run, but written down, the ma in 달리지마 is the Hanja Chinese character meaning horse. So there seems to be some sort of wordplay going on there, which we'll get to later. Now about webtoon shi. Most listeners familiar with Korean culture today will know about webtoons, even if they don't know about webtoon shi. Anyone who rides this whole subway, especially nowadays, I think, will often catch a glimpse of passengers reading webtoons, especially since they are designed to be read on the phones, right?
Indeed, you can always see someone, or usually more than someone, people reading webtoons on the Seoul subway, among other activities. But when they're really getting into the webtoon of choice, you can tell by how fast they're scrolling through it. It's really the 2020s equivalent of a page turner,
right?
A page scroller, I guess you could say. In fact, webtoons have become highly adapted to the reading technology of smartphones and tablets. And skilled webtoon artists, they're not just putting comics on the internet. They're making almost cinematic use of the vertical scrolling format, creating visual and sort of dramatic effects that they aren't the same when you're actually turning physical pages. Nevertheless, though all webtoons do begin on the internet, the most successful ones tend to come out later in the venerable form of the printed book as well.
Right, so then is 달리지마 another example of such a webtoon turned book?
It actually came out in both forms simultaneously. So you have your choice of reading it on paper or scrolling through it on a webtoon platform. And that, I think, was necessitated by its being aimed toward two very different audiences at once. Longtime readers of poetry here in Korea, and especially those of the same generation as Oh Bong-ok, who made his his publishing debut, in the mid-1980s, have certain expectations about how collections are supposed to be published. But most webtoon fans don't have quite as much patience for literary protocol. They prefer to pull up their favorite series and dive right in as soon as possible.
Right, I think listeners will be most curious about how these two forms, poetry and webtoons, actually come together. So can you explain it for us? Has Oh Bong-ok's poetry been adapted into comics, or is it more like he wrote these particular poems with the intent of putting them into a visual medium?
Yeah, one of this collection's variety of unexpected characteristics is that every poem appears twice. First in the webtoon illustrated form, then again by itself, as the poet would have composed it on a page afterward.
Okay.
So I ended up actually reading both every time, not just the webtoon version, and finding that each one was its own distinct reading experience. And in fact, my attention was sometimes so drawn away by the art in the webtoon version that I'd forgotten quite how the poem sounded after that first time I read it. So I needed that second text-only version there.
Sure, that's very interesting. So you get the best of both worlds, essentially, but also you can appreciate them in their own individual formats. A very interesting decision. We've mentioned Oh Bong-ok, who wrote the poems. So who created the illustrations then, the art?
The question isn't so much who as how. All the art in this book, 달리지마, was made with something called Tunit, which is an online illustration application that anyone can use to make webtoons. You can think of it in English, tune it, make it into a webtoon.
Right, okay.
You don't have to be able to draw. You just have to be able to configure how you want your characters and backgrounds to look, and then to arrange them all into panels. So from what I've seen, there are videos online about it, the user experience of Tunit looks a bit like one of those world-building video games, combined with the kind of digital tools used by movie storyboard artists.
Wow, okay.
And it probably won't come as a surprise that Tunit is a Korean-made application, given how many aspiring webtoon creators there are in this country. And, when young people here get asked what their professional dream is, manhwaga, or comic artist remains a fairly popular answer.
Indeed. So it's not quite AI as such, but it is a sort of tool to help generate content for those who might not be artistically inclined, shall we say. I'm sure
exactly.
It has perhaps courted controversy, such as concerns that it's stealing jobs like a lot of AI technology, but I guess it does open up the door for more voices who want to tell their stories in this medium to do so. And while it has already attracted a wide number of voices encompassing a wide variety of subject matter, webtoons I'm talking about,
yes.
This could further, I guess, expand that, to expand and widen the library of people, places and things.
Yeah, it's a whole application that has people, places, and things you can use. And there's familiar buildings. There's the you'll recognize the Goto, the Gosok bus terminal, in this book as well.
Okay.
That's just been dragged and dropped. But listeners won't necessarily have guessed from hearing our conversation so far. But this book's title, Dalejima, you mentioned at the top of the show, it uses the hanja for ma, meaning horse, but there are horses in this book. It's not just people, places, and things, but there are animals in this book as well.
Right, okay.
Horses, to name one example, and especially race horses, figure prominently in some of these poems, especially these two cycles, one of them called 동마의 노래, and another, the sixth part, 사랑은 경마장처럼. And the title poem, Dalejima, which comes in two parts, shifts between the reality of a man driving somewhat recklessly in modern-day Seoul, modern-day Korea, and his own visions of himself as a kind of noble Native American warrior on horseback.
Okay, so we have more than one double meaning at work here then, with the ma in 달리지마 being a horse, but also with the fact that the verb 달리다 can apply to both a horse and a car, as in running. So clearly, Oh Bong-ok is a poet with a taste for wordplay, as I mentioned earlier.
Wordplay is a big part of this collection, it's true. This is his fourth book, and it's not entirely lighthearted, not wholly lighthearted, but it is much more so than his best-known work, 붉은산 검은피, or Red Mountain Black Blood, which is an epic poem dealing with a 1946 coal miners' strike in Hwasun that was violently put down by the U.S. military government of that time. And though it was published more than 40 years after the incident that it's about, it was still banned, which wasn't even the worst possible fate. In the late 1980s, you could still go to jail for writing about something that officialdom didn't want you to write about. More representative of the sensibility of Dalejima is the poem Hetal, which can be translated as Nirvana, the Buddhist concept of liberation from the trials of worldly existence, not the 90s grunge band.
Right, okay.
And its narrator is sitting in an Insadong coffee shop when he watches a trio of Sinim, or Buddhist monks, enter and conduct themselves exactly like high school kids, chattering and laughing excitedly. 그 순간 날 깨달았다. 아이가 되는 게 해탈이다. Those are the poem's final lines. In that moment, it came to me. Becoming a kid is nirvana. And as a poem alone, this is fairly charming, and imagining the scene will remind some of us, those of us who have spent enough time in Insadong anyway, or any neighborhood with a Buddhist temple, of things we've witnessed in our own lives. But of course, in this book, it gets the complete webtoon treatment. We see the coffee shop, and we see the contrast with the monks and their gray robes and shaven heads and all. But the art also adds content to the poem by providing the monks with dialogue bubbles. We see them ordering akama. Have you heard the term akama?
Right.
What would you think that is? Akama.
I'm not sure.
Iced caramel macchiato.
Right.
Iced caramel macchiato, one of the Turinmaler.
Right, of course.
The truncated slang.
Sure,
Very
yes.
hip. But the monks use it, apparently. You hear them talking about going to Hongdae and singing along to the latest K-pop girl group hit. This is content not in the poem itself, but it is in the webtoon. We end up on a page lined with lotus blossoms, and on that page the monks are enjoying their sweet coffee drinks with the enlightenment literally radiating off their heads. And this is, you might imagine it like this, or you might not, but the webtoon gives you all this visually.
Okay, so yes, we have the book in front of us and the poem that you've talked about as well. And it is quite charming and cute illustration to accompany the poem, but it seems to be far from the only piece of eye-catching art in this book. Just flipping through it, one gets the impression of an abundance of humour, emotion and action as well as a certain degree of, shall we say, absurdity as well.
Yes, indeed. It's no more your usual webtoon than it is your usual book of poetry. The concept of webtoon shi is brand new, of course, but the history of the illustrated poem stretches back at least to 13th century China, and over that whole span of time, accompanying verse with art has never been a particularly easy task. What with the question of whether and how to visually literalize poetic metaphor and ambiguity, as well as the separate question of how realistic or abstract the art itself should be. Dalijima does a bit of everything, dragging and dropping the elements of the familiar world right alongside vivid, even lurid flights of fantasy. It suits the kind of poetry Oh Bong-ok is writing in this phase of his career, which captures those times when the unexpected or imagined suddenly breaks through into ordinary life.
Right, so it appears to be quite a groundbreaking work as such in its own way, one that I fear perhaps will not become available in an English translation anytime soon. It is rather unique.
It's true, even the title would be hard to translate into English, to capture having the hanja in there with its meaning, or even dalida and its double meaning. My wife is a poetry translator. She knows better than I do that poetry is not the easiest thing to convert to another language, but this poetry as well, you can see where the challenges would be.
Exactly, especially because he is so enjoys word plays. It is perhaps a shame that it can only really be appreciated by Korean readers, as in readers who can read Korean for now, but perhaps we might be able to see some formal work like this in English as well at some point. I'm sure someone might be interested in the challenge, and in the meantime, even if your Korean is limited, I think it could be worth checking out, as it is quite interesting. Even just seeing it as a visual work and a book as well.
And the visuals would help you understand. Comics are always good for Korean learners.
Exactly.
And this is the one example of poetry in comic form.
Once again, it's called 달리지마 by Oh Bong-ok, and that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, thank you for that review once again, and yes, we'll catch up with you again next time.
Thank you, Jang-ho. See you again.
And that's where we close out another edition of Korea24. We'll be back same time tomorrow, so do join us again then. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.